So we ended last time talking about some notable sex researchers over the past 150 to 200 years. Today we're going to continue that theme at the beginning of today's lecture, and then we'll transition into some chapter 3 topics. But for the start of today, rather than talking about key researchers, we're going to talk about common approaches to sex research. And so we'll begin by talking about samples. And when you have a sample, it's intended to be representative of the population from which it's drawn, and therefore you can make inferences based on the sample to the population. You might be most familiar with this with election polling. So leading up to an election, you might hear that candidate A is 7% ahead of candidate B based on a poll of 700 likely voters in the upcoming election. Those predictions can generally be accurate to the extent that the sample actually represents the population. Sometimes the sample, however, is skewed in one direction or another. Usually we're sophisticated enough that that's not usually based on obvious factors. So for example, the proportion of Democrats versus Republicans in the sample and that sort of thing. But sometimes it's due to less obvious factors. And so, well, on election day, we have what's called a census of voters, and therefore we don't have to make inferences about who's going to win, because we can actually count from the population of voters. We can count the number of votes, and therefore we don't need statistics to tell us who got the most votes or who will get the most votes, due to it being a census. With a sample, well, why don't we get a census? Why do we use samples rather than a census on other research, and even any research really? It's a matter of being practical. It's impractical to get a census, that is to survey the entire population for any one research study. It's very costly, very time intensive. People would become very resistant and annoyed by researchers constantly asking them to respond to a survey or participate in research if they were approached for every study that's done. And so it's really impractical to do a census, but a sample is reasonable, and it can be done, and it can be successful to the extent that the sample is an accurate representation of the population from which it's drawn, and the population from which it's drawn is an accurate, or is actually the population to which you want to generalize. So a couple of limitations in particular in that regard with sex research: the dependence on volunteers. There are particular concerns with relying on volunteers for something like sex research. If you're asking somebody to report who they would vote for in the upcoming election, that's perhaps less uncomfortable for people than asking them to report how often they masturbate, when is the last time they had sex, what are their fantasies, sexual fantasies, whatever the case may be, whatever you're trying to study with regard to sex. You're going to get a skewed sample from the population, because those who are less comfortable talking about their sexuality, who are less sexually literate, who are less willing to talk to a stranger or participate in research regarding sex, are not going to participate in that study, and therefore you're going to get sort of a skewed perspective that is more representative of a particular aspect of the larger population to which you want to generalize, and that can adversely affect the generalizability of your findings to the population to which you actually want to generalize. Another key limitation of sex research with regard to sampling is the over-reliance on college students. Again, this is not specific to sex research. However, most researchers are professors, university professors. They have easy access to students. Students are so low cost and low time investment and resource investment into finding them and getting them to participate and so on. And so it's low-hanging fruit. And so a lot of research, too much research, relies on college students who are not representative of the population. They're the military population, the enlisted military population, the population who doesn't get any higher education, who goes to a trade school or some other type of education after high school, or does no education after high school. These are distinctly different populations in the way that they behave, think, interact, and so on many social and behavioral factors, certainly including human sexuality. And so when you rely on college students, you can make inferences about educated, sexually literate, in many cases more sexually literate than the general population anyways, individuals, rather than about the population as a whole. And so because neither volunteers for sex research nor college students are representative of the general population, it makes it very difficult and dangerous to make inferences or generalizations about the population based on the samples that tend to be used for sex research. So the sampling issue cuts across all sex research, but let's talk about some specific approaches to research or research methods. We'll talk about four: clinical, survey, observational, and participant methods. The first one, clinical, this tends to be research on groups that come to specialists or looking for assistance with some sort of disorder or problems. They might be in sex therapy. They might be in a clinical setting for some sort of erectile disorder or something that would bring them to a specialist to be looked at, and then they are recruited into these studies to understand people's experiences and or possible solutions and so on for these particular clinical samples. The limitation of this is that this type of research emphasizes pathological or unhealthy disease behavior. It's not very, it's kind of the Krafft-Ebing approach, where he focused on the pathologies of sexuality. It doesn't really help us to understand. Well, certainly it's useful and necessary to understand the challenges, the pathological experiences with sexuality, but it doesn't help us to understand normative or general population sorts of experiences with sexuality. So it's limited in that way. All right, so the next approach to sex research that we'll talk about is survey research. This can be take lots of different forms. In general, it's either questionnaires or interviews. So it can be a face-to-face interview, a telephone interview. It can be an online or computer-based survey. But it's basically intended to gather information that participants are willing to report in response to specific questions that they're asked. There are limitations to this approach. Participant-related limitations include that participants don't always report their own sexual behavior accurately. Sometimes for example, some people might be inclined to over-report the number of sexual partners that they've had in their lifetime. Other people might be inclined to under-report the number of sexual partners they've had in their lifetime, depending on their own comfort level with their own experiences, but also their beliefs about what's socially acceptable and what the researcher or interviewer might be less shocked to hear. Or in some cases, the idea is to shock. And so they might want to provide an outlandish response depending on the circumstances and their own sort of mindset about the survey and so on. And sometimes people just don't know. Sometimes people have a hard time accurately reporting their own behavior simply because they have a skewed perception of their own behavior. Yeah, and so that can create some complications in terms of reporting. Respondents generally don't want to reveal embarrassing sexual information about themselves, particularly to a stranger. Well, sometimes actually it's easier to reveal embarrassing information to a stranger if you know that person has zero sort of connections to your social network, and so you don't have to worry about it being shared with others. You generally don't worry about encountering this person again. But just as likely is that a person is not going to share embarrassing information simply because it makes themselves uncomfortable talking about it. They could be ashamed of their sexual behaviors or experiences or fantasies or whatever the case may be. And so people don't always accurately report information about themselves. And surveys, by definition, depend on self-report or participant report. And so the only thing that the researcher can know is what the participant is willing to tell them. There's no direct observation of the behaviors or whatever the case may be to provide an independent assessment of the accuracy of what participants report in a survey. There are also researcher limitations. Those include perceptions of the researcher influencing the questions they ask, the types of, the way that the question is asked, perhaps thereby eliciting responses that they anticipate receiving or that they prefer to receive. And so that can influence the way people respond as well, in terms of the way the question is worded or the way it's phrased when it's asked, that sort of thing. Interviewers' gender, there's plenty of research showing that the interviewer's gender, for example, can influence disclosure. So can other characteristics. So the interviewer's age, race, ethnicity, other factors that are obvious, apparent to an interviewee, can be influenced by can influence the person who's responding to the survey. So, for example, in some research I did on swinging, myself and a female researcher, we did qualitative interviews. So we did in-depth, like hour-long interviews with swinger couples, and we had research decisions to make. So did we want to interview them together as a couple or individually, separate from one another? And we ultimately decided to interview them separately. And then do I interview the female and my partner interview the male, or do I interview the male and my partner interview the female? And assuming heterosexual couples, which is what we were looking at, was heterosexual swinger couples and their experiences with consensual non-monogamy. And we ultimately decided that we would interview the same-sex partner, but those decisions can affect the types of responses you get. Couples will be willing to share different information if they're interviewed together versus separately, and different information perhaps to a same-sex interviewer versus an other-sex interviewer. And so these sorts of factors play a role in how people respond to surveys, and therefore must be taken into consideration when interpreting the results and making inferences about how reliable those results are. Next is observational research. This is uh, essentially what it sounds like. It's observing people, and unobtrusive observation means that you're not, as a researcher, you're not engaging directly with those who you're observing. You're sort of taking a step back, looking through the one-way mirror, looking through the peephole, looking through a video camera, whatever the case may be. You're observing from a distance, and the intent being to not impact the way people behave, to let them behave as they naturally would in the privacy, in privacy by themselves and or with their partner, or whatever the case may be with any particular research. The challenges with this are that known observation generally affects people's behavior. People will tend to behave in different ways when they know they're being watched than when they think that they're not being watched. And so that calls into question how consistent the observations are with the natural behavior that's being studied. There are serious ethical issues with observing sexual behavior without consent, as you might imagine, and therefore it's, in some research you can, for example, if you want to watch how a mother and child interacts, you can do that. You can go to a park, for example, and sit on a park bench and watch them interact in public, and make notes and observations about how they interact, and so they don't know that they're being watched, and therefore their behavior isn't affected. Well, I mean, they know that they're being watched in the sense that they're in public, in a public park, but beyond that, they don't know that they're being observed in that way. If you can't do that with sexual behavior, obviously. Sexual behavior occurs behind closed doors, generally occurs behind closed doors, in the privacy of one's home, and with the expectation that nobody else is unknowingly watching. And so observational research, you might remember, was implemented at various times by Kinsey and by Masters and Johnson. And so they were watching behaviors from a distance, or from with participants knowing that they were watching, but trying to understand what those behaviors look like from a distance. And it's certainly been implemented in other research studies, but it does have these known limitations and challenges that must be overcome in one way or another, or accounted for in the interpretation of the results and so on. And the final approach to sex research that we'll talk about today is participant observation. So whereas observational research, as I talked about on the previous slide, entails the researcher taking a step back, removing themselves from the behavior that they're observing and trying to not affect that behavior. In participant observation, the researcher is actually a participant in the behavior that they are studying. And so this can take several forms. It's particularly common in cultural anthropology, for example, where if you're studying, for example, a culture, you might become part of that culture and so integrate yourself in the culture to better understand it from an insider's perspective, to the extent that you can be an insider as an outsider to a culture. But it's a little bit more controversial in sex research. I'll give you a few examples of research that has been done, participant observation research that has been done in sex research. A researcher named Snyder studied prostitution by becoming a customer. And so he went out in his car to where prostitutes, street prostitutes were known to be standing on the street corner, and he would solicit their services and engage in those services. And so he was studying the behaviors of prostitutes and the process of prostitution and so on, by participating in it, by being an insider to it. Similarly, another researcher named Humphreys studied anonymous sex in men's public bathrooms by becoming a lookout. And so he would, tell men who participate in sex with men in public bathrooms anonymously, anonymous sex with unknown men, that he was, the lookout, and he was sort of watching. He would let them know if somebody else was coming, if they needed to break up their interaction, and so on. And so, what he was actually doing, he wasn't a participant in that behavior, in the men having sex with men behavior itself, but he was a participant in the sense that these men who would engage in this behavior would typically have a lookout, and so he became the lookout. And what he was really doing was studying the culture, the interaction, observing, taking mental notes and making notes in between encounters and so on. And so he was participating in the behavior as a lookout, but really he was studying the behavior that he was participating in. All right, now let's transition to talking about communicating about sexuality. And so the first thing we're going to do is, in class, this is a sort of an interactive activity. Students talk with students, and then we talk as a class, and so on. We obviously can't do that in this format, but nonetheless, I think that there will be some value in doing this individually. And so the first thing I want you to take some time to think about is, what messages did you get about sexuality from your parents? What did they tell you verbally, directly? And what did you learn from observing their behavior regarding sexuality? So take about a minute to think about this, and then I'll give you additional instructions. All right, with that minute over, let's say, actually, I'll show you on this this picture up here. This is an advertisement for Redbox, which I don't know if you know what these are anymore. Maybe a decade or so ago, you could go to a vending machine and check out a DVD movie from Redbox. And so this was an advertisement with presumably a mother and her children sort of picking out which movie they're going to watch. And I don't think they really paid attention to which movie they were pointing to. Everybody's pointing to Kinsey, which is a movie about Alfred Kinsey and talking about sex. So it's kind of just a funny thing that whoever was producing that advertisement probably overlooked that little detail. So anyways, you've thought about the messages you got directly, non-directly, indirectly from your parents about sex. Now think about the messages that you got from friends and siblings. And once again, take about a minute to think about this. All right, next, do the same thing once again, but this time think about the messages that you got about sexuality directly or indirectly from clergy and teachers. Again, take about a minute to do that. And finally, take another minute to think about the messages that you got, both explicitly and implicitly, from media. So, for example, television, movies, music, magazines, internet, about sexuality. Okay, now that you've thought about the different messages that you've gotten from these different sources, think about how did their messages differ? What did you get? Consistent messages, for example, from your parents, from siblings, from friends, from clergy, teachers, from the media? Or did they differ? And did they differ in some consistent ways, perhaps even in some cases predictable ways? Why do you think they differed? Assuming that they did, why do you think they differed? Which information or which source did you find most trustworthy, and why? And finally, who was most influential and why? Now, we obviously can't have a conversation about this in this asynchronous format, but what students will often talk about in this activity is that the messages did differ, and they'll come to realize that the messages oftentimes differed because everybody had an agenda when talking to them about sexuality. The media, they're trying to sell, they're trying to engage, they're trying to get people's eyeballs and ears and ultimately advertisers' money by selling sex and the tease of sex and so on. Clergy, oftentimes their agenda is to make you uncomfortable with sex, with the thought of premarital sex, and with any engagement or behaviors that could lead to premarital sex. Teachers, oftentimes the message is, it depends on the teacher and the context, but oftentimes it's more educational, informational, and particularly, for example, in a sex ed or health class that you might have had in, I don't know, maybe 10th grade or something. But at other times, we have developmentally appropriate sexuality education in various schools, and different types of education as well. So, some schools, some school districts, and so on have abstinence-only education, and some have comprehensive sex education. And so the messages you get there are very different. And so the messages that you get from teachers oftentimes are indirectly political messages from that are imposed upon them from government officials for various reasons, and so they all have their own agendas as well. Friends, siblings sometimes have a desire to come across as more knowledgeable or less knowledgeable than they actually are, for various reasons. And oftentimes they're very, maybe they're the most open and direct and comfortable talking about sex with their friends and siblings. However, their information is not always the most accurate. And then parents are kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes some parents who are sexually literate and are comfortable talking about sexuality with their children can be excellent sources of information and provide a sort of a safe place for their children to talk about sexuality. Other parents are very uncomfortable with sex and very give sort of a unwelcoming presence in terms of their talking with their children, or their children talking with them about sexuality. Others are very uncomfortable with it. It's a joke, or it's something that everybody blushes about, that you just have an unspoken agreement to not talk about, and those sorts of things. So the parents probably are the most unpredictable here, in the sense that it really depends on the parent themselves and what their agenda is and their comfort level talking about sex. But nonetheless, it's useful to have some realization that you get messages about sexuality from multiple different sources, and all of those sources have different degrees and different types of agendas in what they're trying to convey about sexuality. And so which one is most trustworthy? Which one can you rely upon for accurate information, for good advice, and so on? It might vary depending upon those people who fill those roles in your social networks. But it's useful to think about and to realize that those when those conversations exist, there are oftentimes hidden agendas in those conversations. All right, let's do another activity. For this activity, you'll need something to write with and write on. So a pen, pencil, piece of paper, or a computer screen that you can type on, maybe a Word document or something like that open on your computer. So go ahead and work on getting pen, pencil, paper, or a document open that you can use for this activity while I describe it. So you're going to need, I'm going to ask you to brainstorm, write as many words as you can think of in the next 2 minutes that describe sexual anatomy or sexual behavior. Doesn't matter what the word is, phrase is, just write it as it comes to mind, and write as many as you can. So if you don't have your Word document open or your pencil and paper yet, then pause the video. If you do, then let's begin now, and again, spend 2 minutes writing as many words as you can. Okay. Now you've got your list of words. I want you to go through that list and figure out, make a list, identify which ones are child language. Put a C next to those. Which ones are slang? Put an S next to them. Which ones are euphemisms? A euphemism is like a polite way of saying something. So, for example, maybe making love rather than having sex. And medical is a medical term. Put an M next to those with medical terms. So C, S, E, or M next to each word or phrase that you wrote. Take a few minutes to do that, and go ahead and pause the video for a second while you do that, and then when you're ready, when you've got them all labeled, then start the video again. Okay, so which category of words did you list most frequently? Count up how many C's, S's, E's, and M's you had, and then think about which one came to mind the easiest, the fastest. Which one are you, perhaps do you know the best, or are you most comfortable with, and so on. When I've done this in class, the answer has been most recently was about 50% of students said that their most common category of word was slang. 39%, the most common was medical, and then few people had child or euphemisms as their top choice. So, slang, it's pretty common. It's kind of what we speak to our friends. It's what we're comfortable with, oftentimes. And for others, maybe in an educational context, maybe medical with a professor. If you're doing this activity with a professor, with me, then maybe you're inclined to write medical words. Maybe you're more comfortable with those. Maybe that's what you were taught as a child, and so on. So anyways, think about which ones you had the most and why. So some examples, after doing this, I'll typically have students give me some examples of words that they wrote in each category. Some examples from last time I did this activity in person in a class. For child language, examples students wrote were privates, Peter, wee wee, boobies, lady parts, bottom, no square, and coochie or cooter. So those are some terms that we tend to use with children when we're describing sexual anatomy and so on. Slang examples I got were doggy style, horny, teabagging, cream pie, cowgirl, getting or giving head, pull out game, and dick. Euphemisms: making love, birds and the bees, hooking up, knocking boots, making whoopee, getting laid, doing it, and getting lucky. And then medical: vagina, penis, breasts, ejaculation, orgasm, clitoris, intercourse, and fellatio or cunnilingus. So we have rich language in each of these four dialects about sexuality, and sexuality is really it's the only, I've been thinking about this for years, and it's the only area of English language that I've been able to come up with where we have four distinct dialects of language or of terms that we use, and we tend to know when and where to use each one. Sometimes we use not necessarily the wrong one, but maybe one that would be less ideal because of discomfort or something like that. But in any case, we tend to know when to use each one. Most of us speak all four of them fairly fluently. Some people, if you're really into the slang, you might be less comfortable with medical. If you're really into the medical, you might be less comfortable with the slang or the child language, and so on. But in any case, we tend to be comfortable and knowledgeable of all four dialects related to sexuality. So I sort of charted these out. We got the four there, and the context or the connotation that we use with each. With child language, it portrays innocence. Euphemisms is politeness. Medical is educated, and slang is cool. And we also, as I mentioned, we have specific people with whom we use each dialect. So child language tends to be used with children. Euphemisms is some varied uses with family, strangers, or friends, depending on our relationship with them and the context of the conversation. Medical tends to be used with teachers and physicians. And then slang can be used with friends. So again, four dialects about sexuality, distinct contexts where they're used, and we know them all pretty well. And so really it speaks to the discomfort that Americans tend to have with talking about sexuality openly, honestly, in a sexually literate way. This isn't true of all cultures. Certainly we're better than many cultures, but there are also many cultures that are better than us about discussing sexuality in just a really matter-of-fact, straightforward, intelligent way. We tend to be somewhere, I would say, in the middle in terms of our comfort level speaking about sexuality. Now, something that we don't do so well, we speak, four dialects of sex, but we oftentimes miscommunicate about sexuality based on ambiguous understandings of some terms that we use in quite commonly in our discourse about sexuality. So what is sex? What is virginity? What is abstinence? That's kind of where we're headed next. Hopefully most of you recognize this individual, Bill Clinton. You might not know, you might be too young to know that in the 1990s he had a sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky. It was reported that he had sexual relations with this White House intern. Of course, he was married to Hillary Clinton at the time, still is. And so it was a bit of a scandal, and of course the Republicans. He was a Democrat, and so the Republicans, in particular, made it a political issue. And so he went on television at the end of a press conference, and he said the following:
"I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky."
And so he was impeached for saying that he did not have sexual relations with that woman, when later it was confirmed that he had received oral sex from her. And so, this is a sort of caricature of Monica Lewinsky. So there was some wordplay there. He was using, I did not have sexual relations. What does sexual relations mean, and what constitutes sexual relations? If that's intercourse, then perhaps he didn't. Could sexual relations be something beyond intercourse, though? Is kissing sexual relations? Having a sexual relation? Is fondling genitalia, does that constitute a sexual relation? Does oral sex, oral intercourse, anal intercourse, do those constitute sexual relation? So he was trying to shrewdly play on this ambiguity about what these words mean. Fortunately, I have a dictionary right here for us to look up some of the definitions of these words. So the first one we'll look at is sex or having sex. This is sexually motivated phenomena or behavior. So any behavior motivated by sexuality apparently constitutes sex. Seems a very broad definition, broader than many might have. Next one, abstinence, deliberate refrain from sexual relations. There's that phrase again, sexual relations, the one that Clinton used. We'll see in a few minutes how that's defined. A virgin is a person who has not had sexual intercourse. So we're going to need to get a definition of sexual intercourse. We'll get that in a minute as well. So intercourse, physical sexual contact between individuals that involves the genitalia of at least one person. So this definition implies that any physical sexual contact, so manual stimulation, touching, groping, whatever, of another person's genitalia constitutes intercourse. Most of us, I would guess, have a different interpretation of what intercourse might mean, but nonetheless, this is the dictionary, Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of intercourse. Sexual relations. This is the one that Clinton used. It says see sexual intercourse. So there's intercourse definition and sexual intercourse. Sexual intercourse defined as heterosexual intercourse involving penetration of the vagina by the penis, or intercourse such as anal or oral intercourse that does not involve penetration of the vagina by the penis. It's an interesting definition again. So by this definition, intercourse is defined as physical sexual contact. It involves genitalia of at least one person. So according to this definition, the second definition of according to this definition of intercourse, the second definition of sexual intercourse would imply that, for example, lesbians can have intercourse, even if a penis isn't involved. You can have, so abstinence, sexual relations. Abstinence implies not having sexual intercourse, so not having penile-vaginal penetration in a heterosexual context, or in any context, not having physical contact of a sexual nature that involves one's anus or mouth, any of that would constitute a violation of abstinence. Virginity, one who has not had sexual intercourse. Do you lose your virginity by having physical sexual contact that involves manual touching, stimulation of genitalia? Most of us would probably say no. So again, even if you look at dictionary definitions of these words, there's some ambiguity, some inconsistency, and even probably some debate about whether these definitions accurately capture what we mean when we use these words. And so there's a lot of room here for miscommunication and subjective interpretation of the words when we use them. And Clinton was trying to use that ambiguity to perhaps portray that something hadn't happened that had, knowing these definitions were ambiguous. Continuing with this sort of line of conversation with the abstinence, virginity, what constitutes sex, there were some studies that looked at this and found, basically surveyed, does vaginal intercourse, so penile vaginal intercourse, does it constitute abstinent behavior? two different studies here, 12%, 10% of respondents said yes. And so they suggested, those responses suggest roughly 90% of respondents said that you are not practicing abstinence if you engage in penile vaginal intercourse. But 10% said you are. And so who are these people? I mean, perhaps these are gay men and lesbians who would not be interested in penile vaginal intercourse and certainly wouldn't see it as a sexually desirable experience. And so perhaps those are the ones who would say that's still abstinence because that's not any kind of sex I would desire. Does it maintain virginity? Most respondents said no. And so if you have penile vaginal penetration, then most would say that you're no longer a virgin. And few to none would say that you're not having sex. You did not have sex if you had penile vaginal intercourse. So anyway, some interesting. Vast majority of people agree that penile vaginal intercourse constitutes having sex and is not abstinent behavior and does not maintain virginity. But some disagree. What about anal intercourse? And I brought up two of them at once. That's fine. Anal intercourse and oral intercourse. So in this case, we'll talk about penile anal intercourse and penile oral intercourse, or oral sex, as it's more commonly known. You can see that by the numbers that it gets a little bit more ambiguous. What constitutes abstinence? Anal, roughly 80% of respondents would say that penile anal intercourse is not abstinent behavior. 20% say it is. And I've heard of stories of some teenagers, females. I'm not sure if it's recent, but if it still occurs, but at least a few decades ago in Latino community, there were a lot of teenage women, Latinas, who would engage in anal intercourse with their boyfriends as a way of maintaining their virginity, and satisfying the boyfriend, giving into his desires and perhaps her desires as well. Certainly females have sexual desires and needs as well. It's not always just the guy. So satisfying those desires and those needs while maintaining their virginity. So that's an approach that some use and justify in their minds. Virginity, you can see somewhat high percentage, especially in one of those studies, said that having anal intercourse is a way to maintain virginity. Although fewer said that it does not constitute having sex. So you can have sex but maintain your virginity, according to some people's interpretations of what these terms mean. And then oral intercourse, you can see that the numbers are even more in the middle. So 60-70% of people would say that you are not engaging in abstinent behavior if you engage in oral sex, but 37% said, yeah, you can do that and still be abstinent. By some of these definitions, I gave an explanation for the penile vaginal. Maybe that's gay men, lesbians. If I had to guess, I would say that the oral intercourse is maybe, and maybe anal as well. Numbers are somewhat higher there as well. Those might be driven by a definition of abstinent behavior as meaning behavior that does not potentially lead to an unwanted pregnancy. Virginity, oftentimes for many people, I think this is associated with penile vaginal intercourse. The definition was certainly more broad, as we sort of work through that. Nonetheless, as you can see, the only about 20, 28, 29% of respondents to these studies suggested that you are not maintaining your virginity if you engage in oral sex. And in fact, half to more than half, 60% of respondents said that oral sex does not constitute having sex. And so the point here is that you can see that even if we just speak about intercourse, penile vaginal, penile anal, oral sex, these are there's a lot of ambiguity here, and people interpret those in different ways, and in ways that could lead to some miscommunication in various sort of public health messaging, educational messaging, and so on, about which behaviors are, well, in a moral context, acceptable or unacceptable, and premarital and all that. But more what I'm thinking here is in terms of which behaviors put you at risk, whether for STIs, unwanted pregnancy, or other sorts of challenges that individuals, especially adolescents, face, who are the recipients of many of these messages about abstinence and virginity and sex. And so this ambiguity creates some perhaps mixed messages and mixed understandings of what's the recommended and or suggested behavior or behaviors to avoid. All right, so going into some more depth on this idea, the 2007 study looked at whether college students would say that they had sex if, and then they asked about a series of, I don't know, maybe 10 different behaviors here. And you can see penile vaginal intercourse, very high, as you would expect, 95, 100%, males, females alike. Penile vaginal intercourse, all very high. 80%, so pretty consistent with what we saw before. Oral genital contact with your or others' genitals, only about 20% of respondents indicated, both males and females, indicated that constitutes having had sex. And then other, manually touching and those sorts of things were even lower. Nonetheless, there were, 5-10% who would say that any of these behaviors constituted having had sex. So there was another study done. Actually, the 2007 study was a replication study of a 1991 study that also looked at college students at that time and asked the same questions. Would you say that you had sex if, and then each of these different behaviors? And so as you look at 1991 versus 2007, things are pretty consistent. The one thing that jumps out is right around here on the oral genital or oral contact with your genitals or oral contact with others' genitals. This change, in fact, was labeled the Clinton-Lewinsky effect, and it occurred roughly halfway in between these two studies. The Clinton-Lewinsky issue occurred roughly halfway between. And so these college students from 2007, where you see the large drop in beliefs that oral sex constituted having sex, would have been about the age where they were getting their first sort of messages and internalizing messages that they would hear in society and the media and in conversation with various people and in various venues about sexuality, and around the time that Clinton-Lewinsky was occurring. And so there was a lot of talk about, does oral sex constitute having sex, the sexual relations, these sorts of things. And so in that sense, in terms of timing, it makes sense that this was called the Clinton-Lewinsky effect. It certainly fits the timeline. However, the authors of the study actually suggested that the likely explanation for this change is not the Clinton-Lewinsky affair, but the Bush era. So President Bush, the second Bush, so the one that came after Clinton, in the early 2000s, when these college students were in high school, for example, there was a heavy emphasis on abstinence-only education and pushing for adolescents to engage in abstinence or to practice abstinence. And so the more likely explanation, the author said, is that these students desexualized oral sex so that they could engage in it while still adhering to the messages that they were receiving about the importance of being abstinent. And therefore, there's other research too that suggests that when you tell young people not to have sex, when those messages are consistent and so on, they might be more likely to delay engaging in sexual intercourse, but they find other ways to express and engage with others in ways that we would call, say, sexual. But in this case, the authors would argue that they simply stopped labeling oral genital contact as sex because they were engaging in it, and yet they were growing up in an era where abstinence was valued or pushed on teenagers. Now, focusing in on those interesting findings, you can see for males, so this is only males, it's blue, so must be male, right? Receiving oral genital and giving oral genital, the change was roughly the same across the years. This is again looking at 1991 to 2007. And then if we look at females, it's the same thing again. You see the same pattern, same for oral, for receiving versus giving. So it's the same across gender, across giving and receiving, and it suggests that it's a very the change was widely experienced in society, or among this cohort of young adults at the time, who again, they were going through sort of a stage where they may have been getting first impressions and first messages about oral sex and other types of sexual engagement as they were approaching puberty and adolescence. And so it's an interesting finding. It would actually be interesting to do this study again for your generation and see who never experienced the Clinton-Lewinsky thing, and see if that was a result of observing that event that was in the news for a long time, or if it's a ongoing trend that continued even beyond that in terms of I guess we could call it the desexualization of oral genital contact or oral sex. All right, and there was yet another study that followed the same sort of questioning about would you say you had sex if, and asked about the same behaviors. This one asked a sample of students and also a sample of professionals. So these professionals were, certified sex educators, sex therapists, sex education professionals in general, and so as you can see that there was a huge difference in terms of what students believed constituted having had sex and what professionals believed constituted having had sex. And so, one's not necessarily right or wrong. However, there's clearly a huge gap there in interpretation or definition of what it means to have sex. And so there can be some pretty important implications there for sex educators, and being sure that they're conveying what they actually mean when they talk about things such as, if you engage in sex, you put yourself at risk for X, Y, and Z. If you abstain from sex, then so on. Students or young adults might be hearing and interpreting that in one way based on their interpretation or understanding of what it means to have sex, whereas professionals are talking about maybe an entirely different set of behaviors that in their mind constitutes having had sex. So again, big picture idea is that we have terms that we commonly use and throw around as if we know what they mean in the context of sex education, particularly what does it mean to have sex, to be abstinent, to be a virgin, to engage in sexual relations. However, there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of what those terms mean and how they're interpreted, both across time, across cohorts, but also at the same time between professionals and those to whom they try to convey messages about sexuality. So a lot to think about there about communicating about sexuality, and where some potential pitfalls are and where perhaps we can do things better.